Nexon, Iron Mace, Fierce Core battle over Dark and Darker service suspension. Except service hasn't been suspended. Nexon Iron Mace interrogation held at the Suwon District Court on the 21st, sharp confrontation over suspension of Dark and Darker service. Nexon and Iron Mace, the developers of Dark and Darker, could not narrow their differences, or settle their differences, until the last interrogation date regarding trade secret and copyright infringement lawsuits. The court actively listened to the opinions of each company, such as submitting laptops containing Project P3 and Darker games. But they haven't done this. On the last interrogation date, Nexon said that Dark and Darker service should be stopped as soon as possible and conducted an intensive PT related to the need for preservation, procedures and emphasizing the need for provisional seizure and provisional disposition. So this has to have something to do with like Korean law, with the lawsuit that they've got against SDF. So this would have been this morning. Like Korean time, it would have been like 9 p.m. last night if you're in the United States. Would have been like the start of their workday. 9 p.m. last night in the U.S. would have been like 8 a.m. Korean time. On the 21st, the 31st Civil Division of the Suwon District Law held an interrogation date for provisional injunction, prohibition of infringement of trade secrets and copyrights filed by Nexon Korea against Iron Mace and 2 others this afternoon. Okay. Officials from Nexon and Iron Mace attended the event. So this is actually the first time that we've heard that Iron Mace has a lawsuit in Korea against them from Nexon. Because this, until now, we didn't even think that there was anything in Korea against Iron Mace from Nexon. About 10 lawyers, Nexon's Project P3 developer and Iron Mace's Dark and Darker developer, visited the court. On this day, the arguments of both sides were sharply opposed. Nexon insisted that a provisional injunction be made quickly. The fact of preempting the market would be enormous if Dark and Darker was released. While Iron Mace argued that it was not appropriate to apply for a provisional injunction for a game that could not be completed and released by Nexon, which we've all figured that those were going to be the arguments anyway. During the defense, Nexon cited Dave the Diver, which is scheduled to be released by Nexon, as an example. Nexon worked on Dave the Diver from 2017 to 2019, but stopped development according to the decision to disband the team and discontinue itself. Afterward, the person concerned was reassigned as the team leader of the project, resumed development, and is set to officially launch in June. Nexon's lawyer said after the development was stopped, the result was preserved and the result was reused to develop the game. Regardless of whether it's released or not, it is a Nexon asset, and if the game is released anywhere, the opportunity to utilize its achievements is lost. If a person who intentionally quits during game development is allowed to use the results as they are in the game development process, no one will proceed with a new project. There's no point in restoring this, so I beg you to make a decision on provisional injunction. Iron Mace refuted that Nexon didn't have the capacity to complete and release Project P3. I saw that Nexon had abandoned the development of P3, predicting the possibility of the box office as low. After Nexon filed the lawsuit, it was left unattended for 2 years, and even after that, it claimed that it didn't make efforts to guarantee any urgent rights, which is true. I mean, like, they didn't file for anything. They didn't make any moves. They knew that these guys were working on this project prior to them ever filing any lawsuits, like a year plus in advance. And not until Iron Mace showed that it looked like it was going to be profitable did they bother filing for anything. But Iron Mace's lawyer said, Nexon gave it development without knowing the success of P3 and filed a lawsuit 2 years ago to preserve money, not an injunction seeking a service ban. It's not reasonable to apply for a provisional injunction based on a game that they have not been able to complete and release. Nexon said, in the past, we thought it was a personal deviation criminal and applied for a provisional seizure, but we couldn't imagine that the person who was disciplined by the company would do this. The court decided to have a hearing period. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that they don't end up mentioning that Nexon canceled the project due to the person leaving. All that's mentioned is that Nexon canceled the project. And it sounds as though the way that Iron Mace has worded this is that they left because the project was abandoned. Because that's what they're citing with Dave the Diver, which is now released, but they had closed down on that project and said that it wasn't worth pursuing, if only then to like reopen it later. Like Iron Mace is arguing that the project was shut down, therefore they quit. And Nexon isn't refuting that, which is interesting because in all of the statements that they've made for all the DMCA and DTSA stuff that they've done in the United States, they said it was the opposite timeline. Like, the reason why it was canceled was because of people quitting. And in this case, with the statements that are being made, it looks like they both agree that the project was canceled first and then people left. So that it's an interesting shift in timeline and motivation, but it may not end up mattering at all. I don't know. And I don't know how Korean court is going to handle this, but the court decided to have a hearing period of about 4 weeks to review each claim. This is because the materials submitted by each company exceeded 5,000 pages in addition to the ongoing lawsuit. Meanwhile, Nexon earlier filed a police investigation and complaint, the developer, on suspicion of taking out unreleased projects without permission around February. Dark and Darker has emerged as a highly anticipated work on the game platform Steam by collecting 100,000 concurrent users worldwide. which we knew. Iron Mace was scheduled to go through early access for Dark and Darker in April, blah, blah, blah. Nexon is known to claim that some of the developers of Iron Mace leaked the data of P3 that they were in charge of when they left Nexon's new development headquarters and created Dark and Darker. The court actively listened to the opinions of each company, such as submitting laptops containing Project P3 and Dark and Darker games. So this is interesting because this means that over the next month or so, there's going to be a third party that is going to look at both games and their source code and is going to make a determination as to whether or not there's like shared code in them between the two. So it'll be interesting to see what they come to in terms of a conclusion. But the most interesting thing here, and the thing that's different, is the argument about the timeline, because Nexon isn't refuting the difference in timeline now. They're basically saying like, yeah, we canceled the project and then these guys left, but we didn't know that they were going to do this, and it's shitty of them. But they didn't say that they canceled it because the guys ended up quitting. It was just like the guys left because they canceled the project, and they're like, yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah, so Nexon's lawyer said after the development was stopped, the result was preserved, and then the result was reused to help to develop the game when he talked about Dave the Diver. Regardless of whether it's released or not, it's an asset of Nexon. If the game is released elsewhere, the opportunity to utilize its achievements is lost, right? So, yeah, but apparently they did not, the judge did not grant the injunction. They said that they were going to see it over. So no injunction granted. They get to keep conducting business, which is, that's a W for Iron Mace. It's a huge W for Iron Mace because they, like, the TRO failed. Like, the temporary injunction failed against Iron Mace today, which is huge. Because if they had a temporary injunction, that would have been it. Again, we're talking about Korean court proceedings, and I don't know how often they are granted injunctions, you know, because of, you know, Corporation 1 versus Corporation 2, and Corporation 1 asks for an injunction. I don't know how often, you know, Korean courts grant these kind of things. Like, do they almost never do them? Is it usually all the time? But either way, it allows Iron Mace, at least for the interim period, which looks like this is going to be 4 weeks. Court decided to have a hearing period of about 4 weeks to review each claim. The materials submitted by each company exceeded 5,000 pages in addition to the ongoing lawsuit. So the court did not grant the injunction. They asked for one. They asked for a provisional injunction, and the court did not grant it. So that allows Iron Mace, at least for the next month, to continue to work on and develop their game. And that is not something that Nexon wanted to have happen, obviously. That Nexon would have loved to have stopped them in their tracks. But the court didn't give it to them. So that's a huge W for Iron Mace. They have to be happy with that. They'll try to spin this for sure and say that it grants some merit to their case because not even the Korean court, which according to people in Korea and people localized, like, you know, in the area that live there, and the media and the spin that's been put on it, people tend to be like pro Nexon in this case between the two parties. So even with that, like the public eye kind of being more favorable toward Nexon versus that of Iron Mace still didn't end up getting anything against them. So, and this is actually what they wanted. Iron Mace requested this at the beginning and said, we want a third party to review both sets of stuff to see what, you know, there is to say, versus giving it to Nexon and having Nexon review it internally. That's what they wanted from the beginning. So in a way, Iron Mace kind of got what they wanted out of this at the start. This looks and reads like it's really good for Iron Mace at the very beginning. They got a lot more battles to go, right? But this looks pretty good for them. It's kind of a W. Kind of a W for them. Cool. Really cool. I'm actually happy to read this. We'll get it up on the Patreon, and I'll have Saint edit it up. There you go.